In the Second World War, humanity faced the ultimate test of survival as entire nations were drawn into conflict. Massive armies marched across continents, and for millions of ordinary people, every choice was impossible. Industry became the battlefield. Factories that once built cars and tools now forged weapons and death machines. Cities turned to dust under relentless bombing campaigns. Populations starved under brutal sieges, and in the shadows, racial ideologies fueled the horror of genocide. At the heart of it all were ordinary men and women, people who revealed both the brilliance and the brutality of human nature. Some gave their lives, others gave their souls. All were consumed by the demands of total war. To wage such a war, every part of society had to transform. Economies shifted overnight. Populations were mobilized. Industries retooled for mass destruction. The world had tried to avoid another catastrophe after the First World War. Peace treaties were signed, promises were made. But as the 1930s unfolded, one agreement after another fell apart. The illusion of peace began to crumble. By the mid-1930s, nations were preparing in earnest. Governments, generals, and even ordinary citizens knew that the next great war would be fought not just with soldiers and tanks, but with factories, workers, and entire economies. It would be fought everywhere, in the air, on the seas, in the hearts of nations, and in the will of their people. After the First World War, fear of another total war haunted everyone. Leaders gathered at disarmament conferences, hoping that diplomacy could prevent the next arms race. Treaties were signed in Geneva in 1932 and 1933, attended by 60 nations. But all hope collapsed when Germany demanded equal military power with other Western nations. When its demands were denied, Germany and Japan walked out of the League of Nations. The dream of a peaceful, disarmed world was over. Meanwhile, militarization was already underway. Hitler secretly began rebuilding Germany's armed forces in 1933, violating the Treaty of Versailles. By 1935, his intentions were no longer hidden. Conscription returned. Armies expanded from 100,000 men to 500,000. A new air force, the Luftwaffe, took shape. Hitler's four-year plan set the goal. Germany must be ready for war within 4 years, its economy fully capable of sustaining it. He envisioned autarky, self-sufficiency, where Germany would produce everything it needed without relying on foreign trade. From the outside, Nazi Germany looked like a model of efficiency, a nation perfectly organized for war. But inside, it was chaos. Factories produced hundreds of different airplane models, dozens of truck types, and a mess of incompatible machinery. The German war machine was impressive, but deeply flawed. Britain watched uneasily, pursuing a dual strategy: rearm where necessary and appease where possible. The policy of appeasement, avoiding confrontation at all costs, was born out of the trauma of the First World War. No one wanted another bloodbath. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. The event, called the Anschluss, was followed by a sham referendum showing near-unanimous support. Britain didn't object. Soon after, Hitler set his sights on the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German population. Once again, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sought peace. The Munich Agreement of 1938 handed the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for promises of peace, promises that would soon be broken. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." But in truth, war had only been delayed. As nations armed themselves, the arms race accelerated. The world's budget swelled with military spending. Britain expanded its navy and air force, preparing for a war fought at long range, by sea and by air. France built the mighty Maginot Line, a concrete fortress meant to stop any German invasion. But the future belonged not to fortresses, but to speed, technology, and mechanized warfare. The Blitzkrieg. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, also saw what was coming. Determined not to be caught unprepared again, Stalin's five-year plans turned the USSR into an industrial giant. Farms were collectivized, factories nationalized, and millions of peasants, the kulaks, perished in the brutal transformation. The Soviet people paid dearly, but the nation emerged hardened, industrialized, and ready for total war. By the time the 1940s began, production itself had become a weapon. Germany, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States all understood that victory would depend as much on steel and oil as on strategy. In the United States, isolationism still dominated the 1930s. Scarred by the Great Depression and weary of European entanglements, Americans wanted peace. Factories that once produced weapons had been dismantled. But as the world darkened, President Franklin D. Roosevelt realized neutrality could not last forever. America, he declared, must become the arsenal of democracy. Through the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. began supplying weapons, food, and resources to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations. In return, America gained influence, not just as a supplier of weapons, but as the new global financial power. When the U.S. finally entered the war after 1941, its industrial might turned the tide. By 1943, American factories were producing a tank every 5 minutes, an aircraft every half hour, and even an aircraft carrier every week. It was a scale of production the Axis powers could never match. Britain, though small in size, drew strength from its empire. Canada, Australia, India, and countless colonies contributed food, raw materials, and manpower. Canadian factories alone produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles and aircraft. The idea that Britain stood alone in 1940 was more myth than truth. It stood on the shoulders of its empire and American support. Germany, too, relied on forced labor. Millions of men and women from occupied territories were enslaved to keep its factories running. The irony of total war was that while technology advanced, humanity regressed. For nations dependent on imports, like Britain, control of the seas was everything. The Battle of the Atlantic became the longest and most crucial struggle of the war. German U-boats prowled the oceans, sinking ships and starving the island nation. Churchill called it, "the only thing that ever really frightened me." Convoys of merchant ships sailed across the Atlantic under constant threat, protected by destroyers, aircraft, and radar. It was a battle of attrition. Who could replace their losses faster? Eventually, Allied technology and coordination triumphed. The sea lanes stayed open, and with them, the lifeline of the war effort. But total war wasn't just fought by soldiers. It demanded sacrifice from everyone, especially women. Across Britain, the number of women in the workforce soared from 6 million to nearly 8 million by 1943. They worked in factories, shipyards, and farms. The government encouraged women to join through propaganda and patriotic campaigns. Posters promised healthy, happy jobs and celebrated Rosie the Riveter, dash-style heroes of industry. Soon, volunteering wasn't enough. The National Service Act made it compulsory for women aged 20 to 30 to work in the war effort. They built aircraft, loaded munitions, and kept the nation running, even as they raised children and faced rationing at home. Many resented the control. Others found new independence and pride. In the Soviet Union, women went even further. Nearly 1 million served in the military, not just as nurses, but as snipers, pilots, and tank drivers. The famed night witches, an all-female bomber regiment, struck fear into German troops with their daring night raids. Heroes like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, credited with over 300 confirmed kills, became legends. But heroism came at a cost. Soviet women labored in factories and fields under brutal conditions. Endless hours, little food, and no rest. Children worked beside them. Many starved, yet they endured, producing the weapons that would eventually crush the German invasion. In Nazi Germany, the idea of women working clashed with ideology. The regime preached Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Even as the war consumed millions of men, Hitler resisted mobilizing women fully, believing their place was in the home. Only late in the war, when it was far too late, did the Nazis begin drafting women into factories and auxiliary roles. Japan faced a similar dilemma. Early in the war, women were expected to support from home, sewing, fundraising, and caring for families. But as defeat loomed, even schoolgirls were sent into factories, and by 1945, trained with bamboo spears to defend the homeland. It was a desperate final act of a nation in collapse. By the time the war engulfed the planet, no one was untouched. For those living under occupation, total war meant terror, bombings, executions, forced labor, and starvation. For those on the home front, it meant rationing, grief, and endless work. For the soldiers, it meant confronting the darkest side of humanity. Total war consumed everything: economies, societies, and the very idea of civilization. Factories became as vital as front lines. Housewives became workers. Students became soldiers. The line between civilian and combatant disappeared. And yet, amid the destruction, nations discovered the staggering power of unity, production, and human will. The war that was meant to end all wars had returned, larger, deadlier, and total in every sense. When the smoke cleared and silence finally fell, the world was unrecognizable. Empires crumbled into dust, new powers seized the throne, and the old order of humanity was gone. The war that devoured everything had ended, but its shadow would stretch for generations. And now, before humanity stretched a monumental task, to piece together what it had torn apart. To rebuild, not just buildings and borders, but faith, compassion, and hope itself. The war had ended, but the struggle to rebuild had only just begun.